In the quiet suburbs of northern Italy, life is often predictable. Families go about their routines, neighbors exchange greetings, and the troubles of the outside world feel far away. But beneath the veneer of tranquility, hidden secrets can fester, waiting to erupt into unspeakable horrors. Guys, please support our channel, like, share, and subscribe. This is the story of Carol Maltese, a beautiful and ambitious woman in her late 20s, had dreams of a brighter future. A devoted mother, a daughter, and a friend, Carol's world was not without its challenges, but she faced them with strength and determination. Little did anyone know that her life would end in unimaginable violence, and that the truth behind her death would reveal a darkness no one saw coming. Carol's life ended in a shocking act of betrayal, a crime so gruesome that it shocked not only her community but the entire nation. What followed was a complicated investigation that uncovered a web of secrets, lies, and a chilling portrait of the man responsible for her death. Carol Maltese was born in the picturesque town of Sesto Caland in northern Italy. The town, with its rolling hills and scenic views of Lake Maggiore, was the perfect backdrop for her early years, a seemingly idyllic childhood, surrounded by family and friends. Carol grew up in a close-knit family. As the youngest of 3 children, she was doted on by her parents and siblings. Her mother, a schoolteacher, and her father, a factory worker, instilled in her the values of hard work, kindness, and resilience. They were a traditional Italian family, with Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations that kept them connected to their roots. As Carol grew older, she began to dream of a life beyond her small town. She wanted to explore the world, find her place in it, and create a better life for herself and her family. After finishing school, she pursued different jobs, from working in local shops to exploring opportunities in larger cities. Carol's determination to succeed was evident to everyone who knew her. But life wasn't always easy for Carol. In her early 20s, she found herself in a challenging relationship that would eventually lead to the birth of her son. Becoming a mother was one of the most transformative experiences of her life. She adored her son and was committed to providing him with the best possible future. However, balancing motherhood with her own aspirations proved difficult. Carol's relationship with the father of her child eventually ended, and she found herself navigating the difficulties of single motherhood. Despite the hardships, she remained resilient, determined to build a stable and fulfilling life for both herself and her son. By her mid-20s, Carol had started to explore new opportunities in the adult industry. She was drawn to the world of online content creation, where she found a way to express herself creatively. Her striking beauty and captivating personality quickly garnered attention, and she began building a following on social media platforms. Carol's online presence grew, and she began to find a sense of purpose in her work. She enjoyed connecting with her audience and saw it as a way to provide for her son and herself. But as she ventured further into the online world, she became acquainted with new people, some of whom would become significant figures in her life, for better or for worse. It was during this time that Carol met a man who would ultimately change the course of her life forever. What began as a seemingly innocent friendship would soon spiral into something far more sinister, leading to a betrayal so shocking that it left those who knew her reeling. Carol Maltese's life was filled with promise and potential, but it was tragically cut short by a man she trusted. A man who would soon become the prime suspect in her gruesome murder. Carol Maltese's tragic death began in late 2021, in the quiet town of Rescaldina, where she had recently moved. She had been living a relatively peaceful life, balancing her responsibilities as a mother and her budding online career. But behind closed doors, her world was far more complex and dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Carol had recently become acquainted with a man named Davide Fontana, a 43-year-old banker and aspiring photographer. On the surface, Fontana seemed like an ordinary man, a successful professional who shared Carol's interest in the arts and social media. The two became close, and their relationship soon crossed the boundary from friendship to something more intimate. Fontana was not just a friend. He was also a man with dark secrets. His fascination with Carol soon turned into an obsession, one that would have deadly consequences. From the outside, their relationship appeared normal. two adults exploring a connection. But there were signs that things weren't as they seemed. Fontana became increasingly possessive and controlling, and Carol started to pull away from him. This shift in their dynamic set the stage for the tragic events that followed. It was January 2022 when Carol Maltese's life came to a violent end. On that fateful day, she had been planning to meet with Fontana to discuss their relationship and, perhaps, to end it. But what was meant to be a difficult conversation quickly escalated into something far more dangerous. The details of what happened next remain shrouded in mystery, but what is clear is that an argument broke out between Carol and Fontana. In a fit of rage, Fontana attacked Carol, brutally ending her life. The exact sequence of events is unclear, but forensic evidence suggests that Carol suffered a violent and prolonged assault before she was killed. Fontana's actions following the murder were equally shocking. Instead of calling for help or turning himself in, he made a calculated decision to cover up the crime. Over the course of several days, Fontana meticulously dismembered Carol's body, attempting to dispose of the remains in a way that would prevent anyone from discovering what he had done. Fontana's attempts to dispose of Carol's body were gruesome and methodical. He transported her remains to several remote locations, hoping to scatter them in a way that would make it impossible for investigators to piece together the crime. But despite his efforts, he left behind crucial evidence that would eventually lead to his capture. The news of Carol Maltese's death sent shockwaves through her community and beyond. As details of the crime emerged, the public was left grappling with the horrifying reality of what had happened to a young woman who had once been so full of life. In the wake of her death, Carol's family and friends struggled to make sense of the tragedy. They mourned the loss of a beloved daughter, sister, and mother, while the nation watched in horror as the details of the crime continued to unfold. The discovery of Carol Maltese's remains in February 2022 marked the beginning of a complex and harrowing investigation. For law enforcement, it was immediately clear that this was no ordinary case. The brutality of the crime and the methodical nature of the body disposal suggested that they were dealing with a calculated and dangerous individual. When authorities received a tip about suspicious activity in a remote area near Borno, in northern Italy, they never expected to stumble upon the gruesome scene that awaited them. Discovered in several garbage bags scattered across different locations were the dismembered remains of Carol Maltese. The macabre nature of the discovery shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Law enforcement quickly cordoned off the area and began their meticulous search for evidence. Investigators from the local police, along with forensic specialists, were brought in to examine the scene. Every piece of evidence was critical to unraveling the mystery behind Carol's death. Lead investigator. When we arrived at the scene, it was clear that this was not a random act of violence. The level of planning and execution suggested that the perpetrator had put significant thought into how to avoid detection. Our job was to figure out who was responsible and bring them to justice. But it wasn't going to be easy. The investigation into Carol Maltese's murder was methodical and thorough. Detectives began by piecing together the timeline of her disappearance and identifying anyone who had been in contact with her in the days leading up to her death. Carol had last been seen in January 2022, and her online activity abruptly ceased shortly afterward, raising immediate red flags. As detectives worked to trace Carol's last known movements, they identified several key locations tied to the crime. Her remains had been scattered across multiple sites in an apparent attempt to prevent identification, but investigators were determined to connect the dots. Each site was carefully examined for forensic evidence that might lead them to the killer. As the investigation progressed, key discoveries began to emerge. Neighbors reported seeing a man coming and going from Carol's apartment around the time of her disappearance. He was described as middle-aged, well-dressed, and carrying large bags, a detail that would later become crucial to identifying the suspect. It wasn't long before investigators zeroed in on Davide Fontana, a man who had been in close contact with Carol in the weeks leading up to her death. Fontana initially presented himself as cooperative, even expressing concern over Carol's disappearance. But under closer scrutiny, his story began to unravel. Forensic psychologist. Fontana exhibited classic signs of a manipulative personality. He was calm, calculated, and tried to control the narrative. He believed that by appearing helpful, he could deflect suspicion away from himself. But ultimately, his actions betrayed him. In March 2022, after weeks of investigation, authorities obtained a search warrant for Fontana's apartment. What they found was damning. Traces of Carol's blood, as well as incriminating digital evidence that placed Fontana at the scenes where her remains were disposed of. Confronted with the overwhelming evidence, Fontana eventually confessed to the crime, detailing how he had killed Carol in a fit of rage and then spent days meticulously covering up the murder. Despite the eventual breakthrough, the investigation was far from straightforward. Investigators faced numerous challenges along the way. The scattered nature of the remains made it difficult to establish a clear timeline, and the remote disposal locations complicated the collection of evidence. Additionally, Fontana's attempts to erase his digital footprint added another layer of difficulty for law enforcement. Lead investigator. This was one of the most challenging cases I've ever worked on. The level of planning that went into the crime made it difficult to piece everything together. But we were determined to get justice for Carol. Every detail mattered, and we knew we couldn't afford to overlook anything. Technology and forensic science played a critical role in the investigation. Digital forensics experts were able to recover deleted messages and location data from Fontana's devices, which provided key insights into his movements and communications with Carol. These digital breadcrumbs became vital pieces of evidence that helped law enforcement reconstruct the timeline of the crime. The combination of traditional forensic techniques, such as blood analysis and DNA testing, and cutting-edge digital forensics allowed investigators to build a strong case against Fontana. By carefully analyzing every piece of evidence, they were able to connect the dots and bring the truth to light. On the morning of March 23, 2022, after weeks of intense investigation and mounting evidence, authorities finally moved in to arrest Davide Fontana. Fontana, who had initially posed as a concerned friend, was now the prime suspect in the brutal murder of Carol Maltese. The arrest was carried out with precision. Fontana, unaware that his web of lies had unraveled, was taken by surprise when police arrived at his door. He was calm when they cuffed him, perhaps believing he could still maintain control of the situation. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and his facade quickly crumbled. Fontana's arrest was the culmination of weeks of painstaking investigative work. Detectives had gathered a wealth of evidence, both physical and digital, that tied him directly to the crime. Bloodstains in his apartment, deleted messages recovered from his phone, and CCTV footage placing him near the locations where Carol's remains were found. All of it pointed to one conclusion: Fontana was guilty. The trial of Davide Fontana, the man accused of brutally murdering Carol Maltese, began in the spring of 2023. The nation watched closely as the court proceedings unfolded, eager to see justice served for the horrific crime that had shocked Italy. The case was not only a test of the legal system, but also a reflection of the larger societal issues surrounding violence against women and the darker aspects of online relationships. From the very beginning, the trial was a high-profile event, drawing significant media attention and public interest. Prosecutors presented their case with a clear narrative. Davide Fontana had become obsessed with Carol Maltese, and when she attempted to distance herself from him, he responded with unimaginable violence. The prosecution's goal was to prove that this was not a crime of passion, but a premeditated act of murder. Prosecutor: Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you will hear in this courtroom is the story of a young woman whose life was taken far too soon, by a man who saw her not as a person, but as an object to control. We will present evidence that shows Davide Fontana meticulously planned and executed the murder of Carol Maltese, and then went to great lengths to conceal his crime. This was no accident. This was no momentary lapse of judgment. This was murder, pure and simple. Defense attorney: While the death of Carol Maltese is undeniably a tragedy, we must not rush to judgment. The evidence you will hear is complex, and the circumstances surrounding this case are far from straightforward. My client, Davide Fontana, did not commit premeditated murder. What occurred was a tragic accident, a situation that spiraled out of control. We ask that you keep an open mind and remember that every individual is entitled to a fair trial. Forensic pathologist. The victim, Carol Maltese, sustained multiple sharp force injuries, indicating a violent and prolonged struggle. The evidence suggests that she was conscious for much of the attack, trying to defend herself against her assailant. The manner of death was determined to be homicide. Digital forensic expert. We were able to recover a series of deleted messages between the defendant and the victim. These messages show a clear escalation in tension, with the defendant expressing increasing frustration and possessiveness. The location data recovered from the defendant's phone also places him at the various sites where the victim's remains were found. Detective. Based on the evidence collected, we were able to establish a clear timeline of the events. Fontana was the last person to see Carol alive, and his movements in the days following her death are consistent with the disposal of her remains. The forensic evidence, combined with witness statements, led us to conclude that Fontana is responsible for this crime. Carol's mother. My daughter was full of life. She had dreams, ambitions, and a bright future ahead of her. To know that someone could take all of that away in such a brutal way is something I will never be able to understand. All we want is justice for Carol. Defense attorney. You've testified that there were no eyewitnesses to the actual crime, correct? And that much of the evidence is circumstantial, based on digital data that could be interpreted in various ways. Forensic psychologist. In my professional opinion, Davide Fontana was experiencing extreme emotional distress at the time of the incident. His actions were not premeditated but rather the result of a psychological breakdown. He did not intend to kill Carol Maltese. This was a tragic accident born out of a moment of uncontrollable rage. Prosecution's forensic expert. The blood spatter patterns in the apartment clearly indicate that the victim was attacked in multiple locations, suggesting that she was attempting to escape. The evidence does not support the defense's claim of a sudden accident. It points to a prolonged, violent assault. Defense attorney. Isn't it possible that these injuries could have been sustained during a struggle, rather than a premeditated attack? Could the spatter patterns not also indicate a chaotic, unplanned event? After weeks of testimony, expert analysis, and emotional witness statements, the case was finally in the hands of the jury. Their task was to determine whether Davide Fontana was guilty of premeditated murder, or whether the defense's argument of a tragic accident held any merit. The deliberations were tense and lengthy, with jurors carefully considering every piece of evidence before reaching a decision. Foreperson. We, the jury, find the defendant, Davide Fontana, guilty of the murder of Carol Maltese. With the guilty verdict delivered, justice was served for Carol Maltese. For her family, the decision marked the end of a painful chapter, but the scars of her loss would remain forever. Davide Fontana was sentenced to life in prison, a fitting punishment for the cruelty of his crime. The trial of Davide Fontana brought closure to one chapter of the tragic story of Carol Maltese, but the pain and loss felt by her family and friends would linger for a lifetime. The guilty verdict was a moment of justice, but for those who loved Carol, it could never truly replace what was taken from them. The outcome of the trial resonated far beyond the courtroom. Across Italy, the verdict was seen as a statement, a message that crimes like the one committed against Carol Maltese would not go unpunished. Advocates for victims of violence praised the court's decision, while also emphasizing the ongoing need for systemic change to protect vulnerable individuals.